Can you recall a time in your life, and I clearly can, when learning was relatively easy, perhaps even fun, and worst case, manageable? I'm also sure if you're above a certain age at least, you've had periods in your life where you really needed to learn something. It was either part of a bigger goal or it was kind of forced on you, and you found yourself unable to get started. Perhaps you went through a few steps but kind of fizzled out, or maybe you forced yourself through it but discovered that you can't remember anything at the end. There are a number of factors that play into this. Of course, there's motivation, there is proper feedback, and there are things that help us recall things better. And a lot of this can be combined under a common heading, context. The context within which you learn has a lot of impact on your success. School, for example, offers a very rich context. You may not remember school very fondly, or maybe you loved it, I don't know. But I'm pretty sure that if you think back on it, you will realize that it was a very rich environment for learning. First of all, motivation. Maybe it was a negative motivation. You didn't want to flunk a test because you don't want to take that paper back to your parents, or maybe it was positive. There was a college that you were aiming for and you really worked day and night. There are also other things that a school provides, such as rich feedback. You see your grades and you talk to your friends, cues in the environment, posters maybe, other working materials. And of course, there is the sense of progress and review. Like before an exam, you get to review things, and then it makes it easier for you to recall them. Now, the thing about context is, first of all, it's kind of underrated how powerful it is in forming habits, in learning, and other things. But the good news is, if you cannot find the proper context, you can create it. In fact, if you do create your own context within which you learn something new, then it might even be better than the ones that you kind of stumble onto because it will be personalized. Now, in this video, I'm going to go through a series of methods to create these contexts specifically for learning, but you might also adjust them for forming good habits or kind of losing bad habits. So I will be using a mind map from Mindmaps, and I will put together a few techniques that will cover things like motivation, feedback, and also a few methods that you can employ to make sure you retain that information. So stick around. This is going to be very helpful, and I'm pretty sure it's something that you will put to good use. Okay, so let's get started. As usual, I will go through the process using examples that I've developed for myself so that you can see how it organically came into being, and I will rebuild some of the steps to show you how it was constructed. Now, when it comes to context, one of the important things that a context provides is motivation and the ability to see where certain things fit in. Now, this is also important in not memorizing, but creating good memories, solid memories, is to create connections between different concepts. So you can read about something, but if it's linked to something else, for example, you read a poem, but that poem reminds you of a location, whereas, it also links, let's say, to a song, something. Suddenly those connections make it much easier for you to understand and recall the primary content, which was the poem to start with. So here, what I'm showing you on my screen is a task that was developed as part of another video, but it's also a real task that I'm working on, which is to create a video on a poem by T.S. Eliot called Preludes. And here I was working on a 3D model. And I reached a point where I realized that I have to learn to UV map a model, which is to add the texture. I can create the model, but I need to put images or colors onto the model to bring it to its final form. So what I did was I went through a Blender course, which is more comprehensive than just the texturing, but I went through the texturing section specifically for this. Now, how does this provide context? What it does is it puts this task of learning 10 lessons that I have to cover into a context, which is that I want to finish texturing this model, which in turn is linked into this animation, which in turn I can go back and look at the whole of the task itself, which was the poetry. So this is something that gives me a rich meaning of why I want to do this. This is only part of it, and I will show you another example which is a lot more complicated, but let's just get started with this for the basics. Now, the first thing you want to do, or I suggest that you do, is create the task, which is relatively simple. You can either pull out a node from the topic that you're building on, or you can use the tab button. You can click on a node and click tab. Same thing. You will pull out something out of here. I usually add a style. I'm not going to go into much detail here because this is something I've covered elsewhere, but I usually, for example, I'll just copy this here, Control Alt C, Control Alt V. So I just copied it here, and you can say something like finish the Udemy UV course. So here, once this task is complete, what I want to do is I want to create another one. The reason I'm doing this is because the task and the course notes may be separated at a later time. I might want to carry it somewhere else. Perhaps I will finish the other lessons as well, and I will just copy and cut and paste this somewhere else. So I want to keep it separated. Now, the thing that I've covered again in another class is hybrid graphs. Now, what I'm working on here in MindDemo is the concept graph, which is very loose, you can create a lot of relationships, you can move everything around, you can group them and whatnot. But the important thing here is that for certain tasks, you might want a bit more of a rigid structure. For example, I'm going to be covering the courses. Here I have 10 of them. I want to list these one by one in the right order because that's the way I want to progress. You can shift them around if you like, but in this case, it was just a linear progression, starting from lesson 56, which is because there were 55 other lessons covering other things about Blender modeling, but I wanted to start from 56 and then go all the way to 66 where the section is finished. To force this onto a certain structure, I click on the button here, or just right click, and then the structural changes can be made in this menu item here. What I do like is a logic chart facing right. So once that is in place, you will notice that it changed a little bit. This arrow is actually pointing this way as opposed to shooting from the bottom. So when I add something here, in this case, what I'm going to say is, let's just make it up, lesson 1 introduction or something. Again, style-wise, I'll just stick with just a simple style. But let me add a few more. I can either just click enter, select this, click enter to create a sibling, and just call it. Now, here's something that I have mentioned in other places, but I want to reiterate. Some of the things you do within a mind map or within a productivity tool such as this can be understood by the code itself. Some of it is for you. It's visual, but it's a visual feedback. For example, I'm not going to turn these into tasks with due dates. I don't want to really go through that overhead of making each one a task. But what I want to do is I want to have a visual indicator as to my progress. So what I can do here is click on this and select the color, for example, yellow. Yellow for me means that I have not worked on that lesson yet. So for example, here previously, and maybe in the other example I can just show you, here in the more complicated example, I have a bunch of yellows and whites, and I'll show you what the other things are. But basically, this means yellow is pending and white is a completed lesson. Going back here, I just set the colors. And after I'm finished with it, I'll just change it to white. So this is visual. Now here, let's say Shift F2 to bring my notes. And let's say I go through the Udemy class. Oh, before I do that, let me just show you one more thing to make this flow even better. Like, you really want to reduce the friction when you want to get something done. You don't want something to take up time or extra effort. So I do have a link to, let's say, the Udemy class here. And if I right-click this, press enter, and hit the link, I can just copy the link to that page. Or if you like, you can point to, let's say, a wiki page that you're studying. It could be a PDF file that you can access through here. So what that means is once you have this open, you just click it, and perhaps you have a second screen, you just put that there, and you start taking notes. You just want to make sure this process is smooth and effortless as possible. So you start entering your notes here. So as an example, here I have a bunch of notes. I've put in images. So this is for the UV mapping. What you want to do is not write everything verbatim. That doesn't make too much sense. You want to take notes to remind you of certain things. If there are certain steps, it's good to go through them quickly. If there's some images to help, that's good. Plus, they really enforce certain things. For example, in one of the later videos, what I was working on is perhaps, yeah, this is a good example. These are my own screenshots of this process that I used and how the model changed over time. So this is both UV mapping and modeling combined. So these are great. In fact, I can export them into a PDF file. So I have my own personal tutorial if I want to. That's very simple. So once you enter these notes and you turn these white by either just selecting and making them white, or as before, you can hit Ctrl-Alt-C and Ctrl-Alt-V. Once you have these notes in place, the first thing you want to do is to make sure you also have a rich context in terms of remembering. Now, I couldn't go through all of these lessons at one sitting. And in fact, here in this other example, you can see that there is absolutely no way I could go through all of these in one sitting. What that means is I will come back to them over time. And I want to make sure I retain them. Because if I go through these lessons, and let's say I had a very busy week, I couldn't come back to this, something popped up. The moment I go back and I'm on, let's say, 60, and all of these, let's say, are yellow. Let me just make them yellow, just for the sake of argument. Let's say I didn't get to this point. And if I open up 60, the class, and I realize I don't really remember what happened before, you don't want to fall into that. So what you want to do is, the following day after you study these, or just as you're starting the next one, you want to refresh your memory. You want to go up, look at your notes, and make sure you recall all of them. You can update this if you like. You can go back to the videos or the text to update them if you like. But this works wonders. I can't emphasize enough how important this is. To review something one day after, 1 week after, and 1 month after makes you retain that information like you wouldn't believe. Plus, once you get to the new lesson that you, let's say, stalled for a bit, you were out of action for a few days or a week or maybe more. Once you get to that lesson, if you are able to recall the previous ones, you hit the ground running. You may not realize this, but perhaps some of the times you gave up on learning something new was that you got to this point and you realized you don't remember the others, and you just kind of said, oh, this isn't working. It happens. It's very natural. So you want to avoid that. I mean, you want to make sure you review these. And let me get to what these symbols mean, is that once you review the previous ones, you can just click on this plus. You can click on the icon, scroll down a little bit, and you've got this completion rate images. Again, this is just visual. This is just for you, but it is good. It is really good to get this feedback. Because what this means is when I got to, let's say, basic UV mapping, I reviewed this 5 times already. This is out of 8, not out of 10, I believe. Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Get to 8, which is fine. It doesn't have to be 10 or a specific number. But I already reviewed this 5 times, and that feels good. You know, you can see that dial moving, and you realize some of those were reviewed more than others, some of them just once. So you might just, as I come back to this, I might say, oh, you know, let me go back to 65 and 66 because I haven't reviewed them enough times. So that's a good, very good feedback for you. The other thing is you have a chance to put in comments. You can either right-click this and hit plus and comments, or you can click and hit Shift F9. And if there are already comments, you can just click on this and keep going. And what does this mean? This means I see my progress. So I reviewed it 13 days ago, 1 day after that, and 5 days ago. Not bad. And if you want to make sure you stick to the 1 day, 1 week, 1 month cycle, then you have to put a task here. So what I can do here is like look at notes after I finish everything and just maybe assign it to myself and give it, let's say, a week. So I can say on Friday, regardless of what I do here, I want to go back and review this because I've studied hard. I want to make sure I retain this. So those are the things that you can do. Now, how does this relate to something even bigger? This is where you can see this probably looks overwhelming, but I can assure you, to me, it looks very normal because it grew out of just a few boxes. And each time I added something, like I added a task and I worked on this asset on Unity, I took notes and I added core elements and components and nodes. So I kind of covered this and I closed it off. And then I went through a set of samples, and then I started working on my own ontological design. And here's something called an icebreaker. That's for another video. And after all of that, I started pushing certain topics in the learning section. So again, what I do is I go through these and I see this progress, how much I repeated and how much I have to go. And I can start also linking different tasks because, different classes. So if something here touches on another class here, I can create a link and let me just do that then. Let's see. So creating a class hierarchy and then L classes. So I hold down Control, drag out at this, and push it into, let's say, L classes. So these are linked. I can pull this out so it looks a little bit more organized, at least it doesn't overlap, and I can say these classes are related, which is good because then I can go back to this graph and say, okay, if I want to remember classes, I know where to hit on multiple tasks. Editing this is the same way. I'm just going to make it white so it's, I've used white a lot. So let me make this okay, kind of like a lilac color. Anyway, so I can also keep adding these. So what I want to emphasize here is that this looks complicated only because you're seeing it at the first time. But to me, it looks normal. And if you start building up something like this, where you create your own context, which gives you motivation, and then you start taking notes and reviewing them, which allows you to retain a lot of information. And also you see this progress from white moving down, covering all the yellows, which is great feedback because it shows you how much you've done. And then it propels you forward. There's something called a sunk cost fallacy. As implied by the name, or directly expressed by the name, the sunk cost fallacy is a fallacy. It's basically when you invest in something for a considerable amount of time or energy or resources, and then you can't kind of let it go. Perhaps you invested in a person, you helped them out a lot, over the years you gave them a lot, and you want to keep that friendship, even though it doesn't make sense, like you never get anything back from them. That's sunk cost fallacy. Video games sometimes do these, like MMORPGs. You keep grinding at a character, get it up to level 60, and you're like, I gotta keep playing because I've spent weeks and months getting this character to level 60. That's sunk cost fallacy because it is a fallacy. Like just because you invested in it doesn't mean it's worthy. In fact, it might be very detrimental. But what is really nice is here you can use it to your advantage. So once you start working on this, once you start filling these boxes and you want to reach that end goal, sunk cost fallacy will work for you. You're like, I've done so much. I should finish this. It doesn't make sense not to finish this. So that kind of feedback also propels you forward. So not only is it the rich context of where this fits in, why you want to learn it, and where you will go from here, which is great motivation, it's also the feedback that shows you that you have to keep moving forward to get to the goal. And in fact, you will over time discover that once you start closing these boxes, it will become easier to open new ones so that you can get to the next level and you can go from like introductory classes to, let's say, all the way up to master classes and whatnot. So the context that we've created here, just as a quick summary, covers the three topics that are, I think, very important for learning. One is, what is your motivation? What is your emotional link? Because memory and emotions are very tightly coupled. So what is your goal? What is your emotion? What is the end point that you want to reach? So here I can kind of see where I'm going with this. I can see where it fits into the picture. So the motivation comes from this layout, this context that I've created. Secondly, it does a great job of creating another type of context, which is the recalling what came before as you progress. So you can go quickly through what you've done before and up to speed again. So you are more comfortable with taking breaks if you need to, or if life forces you to, because you always know you can come back to this, which is a great feeling. You're very comfortable. You can come back to this like a week later, a month later, whenever you want. There is the feedback of progress. You see how many times you reviewed this, how much you've done over the course of your efforts, how much you've accomplished. And this also gives you a way to kind of keep going after a certain point. Like there's a point of no return because you've just done too much. So it's like flipping the sunk cost fallacy on its head to your advantage. And of course, the retention part is really critical because you can set goals for yourself to repeat this at certain times to make sure you don't forget it. And you can always export this into a document that you can share or refer to at a later time. I am hoping that this gives you a good idea about the power of using mind maps for learning and remembering some of the toughest things you can imagine. And I will also cover the icebreaker topic in another video, so stick around for that as well. And please put it to use as quickly as you can. Just give it a shot. Break down a lesson, break down a course, break down a book into chapters or into sections, and just give this a shot. And I'm quite confident it will work for you. So try out a few things and feel free to provide feedback. And you can check out other examples in this channel or my Udemy class. There's a link underneath which you can access. So thank you very much for sticking around, and I'll see you in another class.